On a quiet Detroit block, where most nights ended with porch lights flickering and neighbors settling into routine, there was one sound that lifted everyone's spirits, the clear, innocent voice of 9-year-old Noah Carter. With a small guitar slung across his shoulder, Noah's songs carried through the neighborhood like threads of hope in a place too often weighed down by hardship. They called him the Little Sparrow. But then, one night, the song stopped. The porch was empty. The guitar was gone. And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything the block had ever known. Mothers pulled their children indoors. Fathers checked locks twice. And Elena Carter, Noah's mother, felt her world collapse in a single hour. What happened next would shock the city. A desperate search, a German Shepherd K9 named Ranger, and a faint sound buried in darkness. A child's song, trembling but alive. Tonight, you'll hear how that voice led to a discovery that would change everything. The neighborhood had grown used to silence, the kind that clings to cracked sidewalks and boarded-up windows, the kind that comes from too many lost jobs and too many nights of sirens wailing down the avenue. But every evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the jagged skyline of Detroit, a voice would rise above the gloom. It belonged to a boy named Noah Carter. 9 years old, slight in frame, with hair that caught the light like copper threads, Noah was known to everyone on the block as the Little Songbird. He never planned to earn a name like that. He simply liked to sing. It was the one thing that came easily, the one thing that made him feel bigger than his years, stronger than the shadows that sometimes crept into his home. Each day, after school, Noah would climb onto the porch of his weathered house, a 2-story with paint peeling like old bark, and settle into the same spot on the top step. Across his knees rested a guitar nearly too big for him, its wood scarred and faded, a second-hand treasure his mother had found at a thrift store. The strings were never perfectly in tune, but Noah coaxed from them something that felt alive, simple chords to carry the rise and fall of his voice. And what a voice it was. It wasn't polished, not the kind you'd hear on a radio or in a choir, but it was pure, clear as water running over stone, carrying a sweetness that made even the hardest hearts pause. People said it had a way of climbing into your chest and shaking loose the dust of sorrow. To the families weighed down by overdue bills, to the men who dragged themselves home from factories with aching backs, to the mothers who counted coins at corner stores, that voice was a gift. Neighbors began waiting for it. Mr. Jenkins, who worked the night shift at the auto plant, often leaned against his rusting fence with a cigarette in hand, letting Noah's songs wash the day's weariness from his bones. The Alvarez sisters, who shared a small apartment across the street, would open their windows wide, arguing less and laughing more when Noah played. Even the stray cats that prowled the alley seemed to gather on the curb, as if they too had learned the hour of the boys' porch concerts. Sometimes Noah sang old hymns his mother taught him. Sometimes he made up songs of his own, little tunes about sparrows perched on telephone wires or about rivers running far away where life might be easier. He sang about hope without even knowing he was doing it. And every time he opened his mouth to sing, his eyes lit with something untouchable, something beyond the grime of his surroundings. One evening, just as winter began to loosen its grip, and the air smelled faintly of thawing earth, Noah's song floated across the block with such clarity that passers-by stopped to listen. A woman carrying grocery bags paused mid-step. A boy on his bike coasted to a stop, feet dragging on the pavement. Even the old man who swept the sidewalk in front of the liquor store leaned on his broom, eyes closed, head tilted as if drinking in each note. For a moment, the street forgot itself, The boarded-up storefronts, the graffiti-smeared walls, the potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. All of it seemed to fade beneath the sound of one child's voice. It was not unusual, but it was always extraordinary. Inside his home, his mother, Eleanor Carter, often listened from the kitchen window. She knew her son's songs by heart now. She'd been the one to plant them in him. There were nights when her shifts at the diner stretched long, when exhaustion pressed so heavy she could barely lift her head, and yet, when she heard that voice drift inside, the voice of her child singing into the twilight, her heart would ease. But Elena was not the only one Noah sang for. He sang for the world he could see from that porch. The tired faces, the hollowed buildings, the quiet ache of a community trying to hold itself together. He didn't understand it fully. He was just a boy. But something inside him knew that his music mattered. He could feel it in the way people's eyes softened, in the way conversations hushed when his first note rose, and so he sang louder. He sang with his head tilted back and his small hands strumming, his voice rising until it brushed against the sky itself. He sang as though he believed someone somewhere needed to hear him. The name came from Mrs. Green, who lived 2 houses down and always wore her Sunday hat even on weekdays. One evening, after applauding one of his songs, she said, "You're our little sparrow, Noah, singing even when the world feels too heavy." The nickname stuck. Children began to call him the little sparrow at school. Adults whispered it with fondness. And Noah, though shy about praise, smiled every time he heard it. Yet there was something in his singing that carried a longing too deep for his years. Sometimes, when the melody dipped into a minor key, neighbors could hear the ache of a child who'd grown up without a father's hand on his shoulder, a boy who had learned too early what struggle tasted like. It was hope, yes, but it was also yearning. And maybe that was why the community cherished his voice so much. It was honest. That evening, as the sun melted into streaks of gold and crimson, Noah's song wound its way through every crack and corner of the block. He strummed, he sang, and the sound seemed to soften even the hard edges of the city. Eleanor leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, a tired smile playing on her lips. Across the street, someone murmured, "Listen to him. That boy's gonna take us all somewhere better." Noah didn't hear. He was lost in the music, his eyes half closed, his thin shoulders swaying to the rhythm. In that moment, he wasn't a child bound to a fading neighborhood. He was a sparrow in flight, his voice carrying the promise of tomorrow. And for those who listened, it felt like a promise they could believe in. The notes lingered, even after his voice faded, like echoes caught in the rafters of an old church. People carried the sound home with them, tucked into their tired hearts, as if it might keep them warm through another night. That was how it always was with Noah Carter. One boy, one guitar, one porch, and an entire street lifted by a little songbird. The porch grew quiet once Noah set his guitar aside, but the music never really ended. It seemed to follow him into the house, into the narrow hallway with its peeling wallpaper, and into the kitchen where the scent of reheated stew lingered. His mother, Eleanor Carter, was always waiting there if she wasn't working another late shift. Eleanor was not a woman who had much time for herself. The years of double shifts at the diner had carved faint shadows under her eyes, and the constant weight of overdue bills had settled like a permanent crease between her brows. Yet when she looked at her son, some of that weariness lifted, as if he were the one carrying her, instead of the other way around. She worked until her hands ached, but she never failed to give Noah what mattered most: her attention, her voice, her songs. Noah would pull out a rickety chair at the table while Elena set her apron aside. The guitar rested between them like a third family member. She would tap the rhythm on the wooden table, humming softly at first before coaxing him to join in. "Do you remember this one, cariño?" she asked one evening, her Spanish lilt soft but warm, like a melody in itself. Noah nodded, strumming tentatively. His small fingers stumbled over the frets, but Elena didn't correct him harshly. She guided his hand with patience, showing him how each chord shaped the foundation for the words. It was a song she had learned as a girl in her own mother's kitchen, back before life had grown so hard. The lyrics spoke of rivers carrying prayers to the sea, of voices rising together even when days felt long and hope seemed far. "You carry this song like you carry me," Eleanor whispered once, smoothing his hair from his forehead. "When you sing, you remind me why we keep going." The absent father was a shadow they both lived with, though it was rarely named. Noah had seen pictures once, faded photographs tucked in the back of a drawer, but he had never felt the weight of a man's arms around him, never heard the steady tone of a father's voice. The man had walked out before Noah could form real memories. Elena bore the silence that followed, trading broken promises for longer work hours and the constant ache of being both mother and father to her child. Still, she never let bitterness shape her love. Instead, she poured it into songs. When Noah sang with her, the poverty surrounding them seemed to loosen its grip. The cracked linoleum, the sputtering heater, the overdue rent notices, they all fell away in those moments when their voices joined. Some nights, when Elena returned home near midnight, Noah would still be awake. She'd find him curled on the couch, guitar at his side, waiting for her. He would blink sleep from his eyes and ask her for just one more song. And though her body cried for rest, Eleanor always obliged. The two of them would sit together in the dim light of a single lamp, voices blending in soft harmony. The sound was not meant for audiences or neighbors. It was theirs alone, a secret shield against the world. And always it ended with laughter. Noah would strum a chord wrong. Elena would laugh until tears shone in her tired eyes, and Noah would collapse against her side, grinning sheepishly. She would kiss the crown of his head, whispering, "Don't ever stop singing, mi hijo. Even when I'm too tired to hear, sing anyway." For Noah, that was enough. He needed no father, no big house, no certainty of tomorrow, as long as he had this, his mother's smile, her songs, and the warmth of her arms. But the truth lingered in the corners of their home, no matter how they tried to ignore it. The electricity bill that came with red warnings, the fridge that sometimes held more emptiness than food, the way Eleanor's shoulders sagged when she thought Noah wasn't looking. He noticed. Children always notice. Sometimes, after she had gone to bed, Noah would sit by the window and play softly to himself, the strings barely louder than a whisper. He sang songs of sparrows and sunlight, of mothers who worked themselves weary, and of boys who promised to be strong. He wanted to ease her burdens the way she eased his, but all he had was his music, and maybe that was enough, too. Because when Elena stirred in her sleep and heard faint chords drifting through the thin walls, she felt less alone. She felt that perhaps they would make it, that somehow the sound of her son's voice could bridge every gap life had carved. Their bond was not built on ease, it was built on survival, on shared melodies, on the quiet resilience of two people clinging to each other when the world gave them little else. One night, Eleanor tucked him into bed after a long shift. She bent close, smoothing the blanket around him, and whispered, "Do you know why I love hearing you sing?" "Because it makes you less tired?" Noah asked sleepily. She shook her head. "Because it makes me believe that there's still light in this world, and that you, my little sparrow, will never let it go dark." Noah's eyes fluttered closed, but a small smile lingered on his lips. He clutched the corner of his blanket like it was a guitar string, as though he was already dreaming of the next song. And for Elena, standing in the doorway of that dim room, The sight of her child resting peacefully was enough to silence the noise of worry, if only for a few hours. It was in these quiet moments, between exhaustion and song, that the true bond between mother and son revealed itself. A bond not easily broken, a bond strong enough to outlast hunger, fear, and absence. And in the days to come, when silence would fall heavy and hope would falter, it would be that bond, woven with music, with laughter, with promises whispered in the dark, that might keep them both alive. The night after Elena's double shift had been especially cruel. Her shoes left faint smudges of grease across the kitchen floor, and the veins in her hands stood out like blue rivers beneath her skin. She moved slower than usual, dropping her keys into the chipped bowl by the door, sighing as though the weight of the entire day clung to her shoulders. Noah was waiting, as always. His guitar rested against the wall beside him, his legs curled up beneath an old blanket on the couch. He didn't say anything at first. He simply studied her face. He could tell when she was carrying more than she let on, and tonight was one of those nights. "Mom?" His voice was soft, unsure. She tried to smile. "You're still up?" "I wanted to sing for you," he whispered, sitting straighter. "You always look less tired when I do." Elena chuckled, though the sound carried both tenderness and fatigue. "You shouldn't stay awake just for me, mi amor. You need your rest." Noah shook his head firmly, his small jaw set with surprising stubbornness. "I don't care if I'm sleepy. I'm going to sing loud enough for you to hear me, even when you're tired, even when you're too tired to listen." The words struck her like a sudden warmth, so unexpected, she felt her throat tighten. For a moment, she saw him not just as her son, but as something larger, a light the world hadn't yet managed to dim. She lowered herself onto the couch beside him, pulling him close. "Promise?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, resting his head against her shoulder. "Promise. I'll sing so loud you'll always find me." Elena didn't know then how those words would one day echo back to her in a way she couldn't yet imagine. But in that quiet living room, with the lamp casting a weak glow against the faded wallpaper, she felt the promise root itself deep in her heart. Noah reached for his guitar, fingers brushing the strings with that hesitant confidence of a child still learning, but already certain he was meant to play. The first notes were uneven, but his voice was steady. He sang a lullaby she had taught him, one her mother had once sung to her. His words slipped into Spanish here and there, an old language tied to memory, to heritage, to the bloodline of women who had carried their families through hardship. Elena closed her eyes. The melody wrapped around her exhaustion like a blanket. For the first time all day, her chest loosened. She allowed herself to simply breathe. The sound drifted beyond the walls of their home. Through the cracked window, out into the narrow street, Noah's song spread like soft light. Neighbors stirred. Mr. Jenkins, sitting on his stoop with his head bowed, lifted his face toward the sound. The Alvarez sisters, preparing for bed, leaned out their window to listen. Even Mrs. Green, whose eyesight was failing, sat straighter in her chair by the window, whispering, "Our little sparrow's at it again." And so the block was reminded that even when life pressed them flat, beauty still found a way to rise. Noah's voice was not just a child's attempt at song, it was a lifeline, even if no one knew yet how literally true that would become. Each note carried the quiet declaration he had made to his mother. "I'll sing so loud, you'll always find me." The guitar thrummed gently beneath his hands, his thin shoulders swaying as if the music pulled him beyond himself. Elena kept her arm around him, her tired head resting against his. Her eyes filled, not with sorrow this time, but with something tender. A recognition that love could sometimes be enough to hold two people steady against the world. The song reached its final note, lingering in the air like a prayer unanswered, but not forgotten. For a long time after, silence reclaimed the room. But it was not the heavy kind. It was the silence that follows something sacred. Elena kissed the top of his head. "You keep your promise, Noah, and I'll keep mine, to always listen." The boy smiled, half asleep now, but satisfied. "Deal," he murmured. She guided him to bed, tucking him beneath the worn blanket, her heart still echoing with his words. In the hush of that small room, she understood. One day, his voice might matter in ways neither of them could yet see. Later, as the sun melted into the horizon, Noah's voice rose again, this time from the porch. The block bathed in golden light as he sang one more time before sleep, strumming his little guitar, his promise carried into the twilight. People stopped in their tracks. A couple walking their dog paused to listen. A bus slowed as it rumbled down the street. Children playing with chalk on the pavement looked up, their faces bright with wonder. The notes rose higher, threading through the rooftops, weaving into the soft hum of the city. It was as though Noah's voice had been stitched into the very air, impossible to ignore. From her kitchen window, Eleanor leaned against the frame, exhausted but smiling. And for a brief moment, she felt like the tiredness of her bones no longer mattered, because her son had made good on his word. He was singing loud enough for her to hear, louder than the noise of the world, louder than her fatigue. As the sun slipped fully behind the buildings, Noah's last note hung suspended, a promise set to music. It was fragile, yes, but also unbreakable. And then long after the street grew dark, neighbors still carried the sound with them, tucked away like a secret light. It was the night a child's vow became more than just words. It was the night his voice, bright and unyielding, became a thread that tied him to his mother, to his block, and, in time, to something far greater. The evening began like so many others. The sky stretched wide and bruised with the colors of sunset, violet melting into crimson, the last threads of gold slipping between tired rooftops. Families shuffled home from long days, the hum of the city settling into its usual rhythm, and as always, people waited for the sound that had become as steady as the streetlights flickering on. They waited for Noah, but the porch stayed empty. The guitar that usually rested across his lap never appeared. The step where he sat, swinging his legs as he strummed, remained bare. The silence stretched, unfamiliar and uneasy, until it began to draw people's attention in the way an off-key note unsettles a melody. Inside the Carter home, Eleanor moved quickly from room to room, calling her son's name. At first, she thought he might be playing in the small yard out back, or lost in the world of chalk drawings with the kids down the block. But when she opened the back door, the yard was still, the swing set creaking gently in the wind with no boy in sight. "Noah!" Her voice cracked against the quiet. No answer. Her chest tightened as she hurried back inside. His small sneakers weren't by the door where he always left them. The jacket he wore in the evenings was gone. But his guitar, the guitar that never left his side, was missing too. And that was when her fear began to climb. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, her gaze sweeping the street. "Has anyone seen Noah?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady, though it trembled at the edges. "Mrs." Green, shuffling out with her cane, looked startled. "Not tonight, dear. Isn't he with you?" Eleanor shook her head, panic rising like water in her throat. Word traveled fast along the block. Doors opened, neighbors leaned out windows, heads turned toward the Carter house. It wasn't just a boy missing. It was the song. the song that had become their anchor in long grey evenings. The silence pressed down on everyone. Mr. Jenkins stepped out onto his porch, his cigarette forgotten between his fingers. "Didn't hear him all evening," he muttered, voice heavy. "That's not like the boy." A mother, pulling her daughter inside, froze at the sound of Eleanor's frantic voice and whispered something sharp and worried in Spanish. The little girl asked, "Where's the sparrow, Mama?" but received no answer. Elena's heart pounded so fiercely she could barely breathe. She walked quickly down the sidewalk, stopping anyone she passed. "Have you seen Noah? Please, did you see him?" But every shake of the head, every furrowed brow, drove the panic deeper. By now, a small crowd had gathered, concerned faces filled with unease. The Carter home, usually warmed by music spilling out of its open windows, stood dark and silent. Someone whispered, "It's too quiet." And that was the truth of it. The absence of Noah's voice was like a wound. The silence wasn't ordinary. It was wrong, heavy, suffocating. The kind of silence that made you listen harder, desperate for even a single note to reassure you. Elena clutched at her chest, her voice breaking. "He always comes back before dark. Always." A neighbor placed a hand on her arm, but the comfort slid right off her panic. She turned in circles, scanning the street, as though he might appear at any moment, guitar in hand, smiling sheepishly, but the porch remained empty. The block began to change with the weight of it. Mothers pulled their children inside, locking doors. Men stood at the corners, watching, muttering about strangers they thought they'd seen. Fear spread quickly, sharpening the edges of the night. For years they had lived in hardship, but there had always been Noah's voice to soften it. Now that it was gone, the darkness felt deeper, as though the city had swallowed him whole. Elena called his name again, her voice echoing off the walls. She thought of his promise only the night before. "I'll sing loud enough for you to hear, even when you're tired." And now there was nothing to hear, only the cruel silence of a broken vow she knew he hadn't meant to break. She staggered back to the porch, gripping the rail for balance. Neighbors drew closer, their concern etched clearly across their faces. It wasn't just her fear anymore. It was everyone's. Somebody whispered, "We need to call the police." But Elena hardly heard. Her mind ran in frantic circles. Where had he gone? Why hadn't he told her? Why was his guitar missing? The thought of that instrument, his constant companion, being gone, chilled her even more than his empty bed. Noah without his guitar was like a bird without wings. The street lamps flickered on, bathing the block in pale orange. The shadows stretched longer, darker. Still no sign of the boy. And then the silence seemed to settle permanently, pressing itself into every doorway, every cracked sidewalk, every worried heart. It was the first night in years without Noah's song. The neighborhood felt it keenly. People lingered on their porches long after they normally would, waiting, straining to hear a note that never came. They carried the absence home with them, like a weight in their chests. For Elena, it was more than absence. It was terror. By the time she sank onto the porch steps, her hands trembling and her heart hammering like a fist against her ribs, she already knew something was terribly wrong. The sparrow had gone silent, and the silence was unbearable. By the time the call reached the Detroit precinct, night had already settled hard over the block. What began as whispers between neighbors had swelled into a single desperate plea. The little sparrow was gone, and in a neighborhood where hope was fragile, No one wanted to imagine what that might mean. Detective Miguel Herrera arrived just past 9 o'clock. He stepped from his unmarked sedan with the slow, steady movements of a man accustomed to tension. Years in homicide and missing persons had carved gravity into his face. There was nothing careless in his stride, nothing hurried, but every step carried weight. Beside him leapt down his partner, Ranger, a seasoned German shepherd with a black and tan coat that glistened under the street lamps. The dog landed silently, nose already lifting to taste the night air. To the community, Herrera and Ranger were not strangers. Their names had been carried in local headlines more than once. Canine, team tracks, missing elderly woman through snowstorm, boy found alive in abandoned factory. Thanks to police dog. They were the pair people called when the ordinary rules of luck and chance weren't enough. Elena stood at the edge of the porch, her arms wrapped tight around herself, her face pale and stricken. When she saw the detective, she tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper. He didn't come home. Herrera inclined his head gently. Mrs. Carter, I'm Detective Herrera. This is Ranger. We're here to find your son. The reassurance was calm, measured, but Elena clutched the porch rail as though those words were her last anchor. Neighbors had gathered in clusters along the sidewalk. Some held flashlights. Others folded their arms tightly against their chests, all of them straining for any sign that this was just a mistake. Their eyes fixed on the detective, on the great dog at his side, as if both represented the thin line between despair and salvation. Herrera crouched briefly, running his hand along Ranger's back. The shepherd's body was taut with focus, amber eyes alert, ears pricked to every sound. The detective spoke in a low tone, a command more felt than heard, and Ranger settled, waiting for direction. This isn't the first time you've done this, muttered Mr. Jenkins from his porch. His voice carried a strange mixture of relief and dread. If anyone can bring the boy home, it's them. Yet beneath those words lingered the truth none dared to voice. Children who disappeared in the city did not always return. Herrera moved methodically. He spoke to Elena in a steady rhythm, gathering details. What Noah was wearing, when she last saw him, whether he carried anything with him. Every answer broke her voice a little more, but the detective listened without letting the weight of it show. When she faltered, Ranger stepped closer, brushing his fur against her trembling hand. Elena looked down, startled, then almost broke into tears at the gentleness in the dog's eyes. He always sings, she whispered, every night. Tonight, nothing. Herrera nodded, scribbling into his notepad. Then, rising to his full height, he turned to the gathered crowd. His voice carried quiet authority. We'll need your cooperation. If anyone saw a vehicle idling near the park, anyone unfamiliar walking the streets, speak up now. Small details save lives. For a moment, there was only the shuffle of feet, the low murmur of people searching their memories. A woman finally raised her hand, speaking of a van she thought she'd seen the night before. A man muttered about footsteps near the alley. Each fragment was small, uncertain, but Herrera tucked every word away as if each might be the thread to follow. Ranger pressed his nose to the ground, circling slowly. His movements drew the eyes of the crowd, hope flickering faintly in their tired faces. This wasn't just a dog, it was their best chance. But with hope came the shadow of dread. Everyone knew what was whispered about children who vanished. The city's streets were not kind. Predators moved like ghosts between boarded houses and alleys, and not every story ended in reunion. The thought pressed heavy on the block, stealing breath from lungs, deepening the silence. Elena, clutching her arms to her chest, whispered again, as if to herself. "He promised me I'd always hear him sing." Herrera heard it. He looked at her, not as a detective, but as a man who had known loss himself, and let the silence settle before answering. "Then we'll follow that promise. Ranger and I will not stop until we find him." The dog seemed to understand. His ears flicked back, then forward again, his nose tracing the faintest scent. He pulled at the lead, low growls rumbling in his throat, eager to begin. The crowd parted instinctively as Herrera followed the tug, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. Some neighbors trailed at a respectful distance, unwilling to retreat into their homes, unable to leave Elena alone with her fear. In that moment, the street seemed suspended between two realities: the fragile hope of a mother clinging to her son's promise, and the terrible dread that they might be too late. Herrera's figure disappeared into the alley, Ranger leading the way, the dog's body tense with determination. And though silence hung heavy over the block, a ripple of resolve passed through the people left behind. Because sometimes a whole community holds its breath on the edge of despair, waiting for one dog's nose and one detective's persistence to pull a child back from the dark. The block came alive with frantic movement, but it was not the usual hum of evening routines. It was sharper, disordered, a pulse of fear traveling door to door, window to window. Flashlights bobbed along cracked sidewalks. Voices echoed through alleys, and every pair of eyes scanned shadows as if expecting the boy to suddenly emerge, guitar in hand, apologizing for being late. But hour after hour passed, and Noah did not appear. Detective Herrera moved with practiced calm, though the weight of time pressed against him. Each moment without a lead felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He sent pairs of neighbors fanning out, instructing them where to search, what to call out. Elena tried to join them, her steps unsteady, but Herrera placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "You'll help him most by staying close," he told her. His tone was steady, but his eyes betrayed an understanding of her desperation. He had seen this before, mothers clinging to thin hope like it was oxygen. The first flyers were made hastily, copies run off at the corner market. Black and white images of Noah's face, his wide eyes and crooked smile, were plastered on lampposts and storefronts. Neighbors carried them in stacks, pushing them into waiting hands, taping them to bus stops. Each sheet fluttered in the night wind like a silent chorus. "Find him. Please." Still, the silence grew heavier. By midnight, the voices of searchers grew hoarse, and the flashlight's beams trembled with fatigue. But no one stopped. Not when Elena stood in the middle of the street, her hands pressed to her face, her body trembling as though the world itself were collapsing around her. "If you hear me, Noah," she whispered, her voice cracking. She dropped her hands, eyes searching the darkness. "Sing, baby. Sing, so I know you're there." Her plea carried down the block. It made grown men swallow hard, made mothers pull their children closer. The community, once bustling with urgent noise, fell silent for a moment, straining, listening for even a single note. But the night answered with nothing but the wind. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. He had been circling, nose close to the ground, muscles taut with focus. At Elena's whisper, he stopped, his head lifted, nostrils flaring. A low sound built in his chest, not a growl, but something urgent, like recognition. Herrera noticed instantly. "What is it, boy?" The shepherd tugged hard on the lead, pulling them toward the edge of the block where a row of trash bins lined the alley. His nose pressed deep into the shadows until he emerged with something clutched gently between his jaws. It was a toy, an old stuffed rabbit, one ear torn, fabric stained from years of Noah's hands. Eleanor gasped, rushing forward. That's Noah's." Her fingers shook as she reached for it, but Ranger wouldn't let go. Instead, he lowered it back to the ground, circling it, nose pressing against the fabric as if it carried a map, invisible to human eyes. Herrera crouched, shining his flashlight over the toy. He didn't need to ask if it was Noah's. The tremor in Elena's voice was confirmation enough. He let Ranger continue, watching as the dog's body shifted from anxious searching to sharp determination. "This is it," Herrera said quietly. "He's been here." The words sent a ripple through the crowd. Relief warred with fear. Finding a trace meant hope, but it also meant Noah had been close and then taken farther away. Elena pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting back sobs. She sank to her knees beside the discarded toy, as if sheer nearness might bridge the distance between her and her son. "He must have dropped it," she whispered. "He must have been scared." Ranger whined softly, pawing at the ground near the toy. Herrera's hand stroked the dog's back once, an unspoken signal of trust. The shepherd's nose lifted, pulling again, eager to follow the trail that now seemed etched into the night air. For the first time since the search began, Herrera allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. It was fragile, yes, but it was more than they'd had an hour ago. He stood, addressing the weary crowd. "We've got a scent. Ranger's on it. This doesn't mean we stop searching. It means we search smarter. Keep spreading the flyers. Keep your lights on. And if you hear anything at all, you call it in immediately." The people nodded, their faces still etched with dread, but brightened by the glimmer of direction. They scattered again, carrying with them the faint but vital sense that the sparrow's song was not yet lost. Elena remained kneeling, fingers curled around the hem of her shirt, as though clinging to something unseen. Herrera bent toward her, his voice quiet, steady. "He left this for us to find. He wants to be found." Her eyes lifted to his, brimming with tears. "Then please," she whispered, "don't stop." Herrera gave a single nod. Ranger, still tense with energy, barked once into the night, the sound sharp and commanding, as if to declare that the hunt had only just begun. The block settled back into motion, but the silence was different now. It no longer felt suffocating. It felt charged, waiting, like the held breath before a song begins. And though Eleanor could not hear her son's voice that night, she clung to the memory of his promise. "I'll sing so loud you'll always find me." She prayed with every beat of her heart that Ranger's nose, sharp and unyielding, was the first note of that song returning. The night bled into early morning, the air heavy with dew and the faint hum of insects waking in the weeds. Streetlights flickered weakly as Herrera followed Ranger down a cracked sidewalk that led toward an old park on the edge of the neighborhood. Once, years ago, children had played here. Swings creaked with laughter. The slide gleamed with use. Now it was a forgotten patch of ground, overrun by weeds and shadow, where broken bottles glittered like teeth in the grass, and rust had devoured the playground frame. Ranger's body was taut, every muscle alive with urgency. He pulled hard on the lead, nose low, tail stiff. Herrera kept pace, flashlight beam cutting across the tangle of weeds and graffiti-stained benches. The dog's growl rolled low in his chest, vibrating through the quiet, as if warning the night itself that he was closing in. Herrera's instincts sharpened. He had seen this behavior before. Ranger wasn't just curious, he was certain. The scent he'd picked up from Noah's toy was here, carried through the dirt and trash, clinging to the park like a desperate echo. "Easy, boy," Herrera murmured, though his grip tightened on the lead. He trusted Ranger's instincts more than his own. The shepherd veered sharply toward the far end of the park, where a heap of discarded junk sat, piled against the rotting frame of an old picnic shelter. The stench of damp fabric and rusted metal hung in the air. Ranger's growl deepened as he lunged forward, paws clawing at the heap. His jaws snapped onto something buried beneath the debris, tugging fiercely, teeth scraping wood. Herrera swung the flashlight down. It was a guitar, splintered along its neck, strings snarled and bent, the cheap wood cracked almost in two, but unmistakable. The very guitar Noah had carried every day like an extension of himself. Herrera's stomach dropped. Ranger wouldn't let go. He bit the edge of the guitar, shaking it as though it were prey. His body quivered with agitation, the sound in his throat no longer just a growl but a guttural warning, as if he sensed the violation of something sacred. His paws tore at the dirt around the instrument, kicking up clods of earth, refusing to back down. "Ranger!" Herrera called firmly, kneeling to take the broken guitar from him. It took 2 commands before the shepherd released his grip, panting heavily, eyes still burning with fierce intensity. He circled tight around Herrera, ears pinned back, nose darting back toward the wreckage, as if desperate to find more. Herrera lifted the instrument into the beam of his flashlight. He remembered the way neighbors had described Noah's porch songs, the boy's thin shoulders swaying with each chord. Now, the guitar looked like the carcass of a bird with its wings snapped. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady. He was here. Behind him, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Elena, who had refused to stay behind despite Herrera's urging, stumbled into the clearing. Her eyes locked onto the guitar in his hands, and the color drained from her face. "That's—" Her voice broke. She staggered forward, reaching out with trembling hands. "That's Noah's." Herrera hesitated, then placed it gently into her grasp. The broken wood creaked under her touch, the sharp edges biting into her palms, but she held it as though it were her son himself. She pressed the splintered body of the guitar to her chest, sobbing silently. He never went anywhere without it. Her tears fell onto the cracked strings, tiny drops catching in the beam of Herrera's flashlight. Around them, neighbors who had followed at a distance stood frozen. Whispers rose and fell like gusts of wind. The boy's absence had been unbearable, but this was proof. Proof he had been taken from them, dragged through the night to this place, forced to leave behind the one thing that carried his voice. Ranger prowled the perimeter, still restless, ears flicking, nose to the ground. He gave another low growl, pawing at the dirt beside the junk heap, then throwing his head up with a sharp bark. Herrera recognized the signal instantly. The dog was urging them on, pressing them not to stop here. But Elena was rooted in place, clutching the guitar as though it were the last thread connecting her to Noah. Herrera crouched beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "He was here, Elena. That means he's still out there. Ranger has his scent. We can follow." Her sobs quieted, but her fingers refused to loosen around the instrument. Finally, she whispered, "He must have fought to hold on. He must have—" Her words trailed into a silence heavier than grief. Herrera looked to the dog, whose body vibrated with urgency, nose already pulling toward the dark stretch of alley beyond the park. The detective knew what this meant. They had found the first breadcrumb. The boy had passed through here, left a piece of himself behind, and Ranger would not stop until he followed it to the end. He touched Elena's shoulder. "This guitar, It isn't the end. It's the trail. Let him lead us. She lifted her tear-streaked face, eyes glassy but searching, clinging to the weight of his words. Slowly, she nodded, pressing her lips against the splintered wood before handing the instrument back to Herrera. Ranger barked again, sharp and commanding, as though echoing the urgency of the moment. Herrera rose to his feet, holding the guitar carefully, and gave the signal. The shepherd surged forward, straining at the lead, his growl reverberating through the empty park. For the first time in hours, Herrera felt certainty. They had found Noah's voice, broken but not silenced, and through Ranger's relentless pursuit, they would find where it had been carried next. The community stood still, breathless, as the detective and his dog disappeared into the shadows, the sound of Ranger's claws scraping against the cracked pavement echoing like the heartbeat of the search itself. And behind them, Elena remained in the overgrown park, her hands clasped as though in prayer, whispering into the dawn air, "Hold on, baby. Hold on." Herrera walked a few steps behind Ranger, the broken guitar slung carefully under his arm. The night air clung to his skin, damp and metallic. And though his body moved with steady purpose, his mind drifted into places he rarely allowed it to go. The sound of Elena's sobs still echoed in his ears. The way she had clutched that shattered guitar to her chest, it had pierced something old, something buried deep inside him. He had seen that kind of grief before. He had lived it. And suddenly, he was no longer Detective Miguel Herrera, methodically following his canine partner across the neglected edges of Detroit. He was 15 again, standing barefoot in the hallway of his mother's small house, the phone cord twisted tight around his trembling hand as the words on the other end sank in like ice. "We're sorry, ma'am. We found him in the river. His younger brother, Diego, only 12 years old. Miguel had been the one to answer the phone. He had been the one to hear his mother's scream as it broke through the kitchen walls, shattering their world in a single note. And he had been the one who carried the guilt, because he was supposed to be watching Diego that afternoon, supposed to make sure his little brother got home safely. Instead, Diego had taken a shortcut by the river. He had never come back. The official report called it an accident. But to Miguel, it was a failure. His failure. Years later, he still carried that ghost with him. Every time he saw a flyer for a missing child, every time he stood in a home where a mother sobbed into her hands, he saw Diego's face. He heard that single unbroken scream, and the vow he had made to himself, the vow he had carved into the marrow of his bones, rose again like fire. Never again. Not under my watch. Never another child lost if I can stop it. Ranger's sharp bark snapped him back to the present. The shepherd was tugging hard at the lead, nose pressed low, tail stiff. Herrera blinked, drawing in a breath, forcing himself to focus. He reached down, running his hand along Ranger's back. "Good boy. Steady." The dog's muscles were coiled springs, vibrating with certainty. He was leading them somewhere, and Herrera knew better than to question it. Still, his mind flickered again to Elena's face. He thought of the way she had whispered into the empty night, "If you hear me, Noah, sing." It was the same raw desperation he had seen on his mother's face when she begged Diego's name into the silence of the morgue. He clenched his jaw. Not this time. Not this boy. The streets around him blurred, their shadows lengthening. He could feel Diego walking beside him in the dark. The memory of his laughter carried like an echo. His little brother had loved to whistle, a shrill tune that often grated on Miguel's teenage nerves. Now he would give anything to hear it again. Herrera paused briefly, hand resting against a rusted lamppost. His knuckles tightened, until the metal bit into his skin. Then he straightened, his voice low, spoken only to himself. "You won't vanish, Noah. Not like he did. I won't let it happen again." Ranger whined impatiently, pulling forward. Herrera followed, the vow burning hotter in his chest with every step. He thought about the children whose names never made the headlines, the ones lost to the shadows of the city. He thought about the predators who treated innocents like something disposable. Each case cut deeper into him, reopening that old wound. But this one felt personal in a way he couldn't shake. Maybe it was the guitar. Maybe it was Eleanor's broken voice. Maybe it was the silence that had fallen over the block like a shroud. Or maybe it was because he saw Diego in Noah, another boy with light in his eyes, another child whose voice carried hope into places that had long forgotten it. Herrera tightened his grip on the lead. "Let's find him, Ranger." The shepherd responded instantly, ears pricking, pace quickening. Herrera matched the stride, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark. Every crack in the pavement, every overturned trash bin, every shadow seemed to hold possibility. He scanned each one with the relentless eyes of a man unwilling to blink, unwilling to miss the smallest clue. Behind him, the community still searched, neighbors calling Noah's name, flyers flapping against poles, footsteps echoing through alleys. But Herrera knew the real trail was here, at his side, in the twitch of Ranger's nose and the growl that built low in his chest. He carried Diego with him into every search. But tonight, the ghost felt heavier, closer. It was as if his little brother walked these streets too, urging him forward. Herrera exhaled slowly, whispering into the night. "I couldn't save him, but I'll save this boy." The vow was quiet, but it rang like iron. Ranger surged ahead, tail whipping side to side, pawing at a patch of weeds that choked the base of an old fence. Herrera leaned down, brushing aside the growth with his free hand. The earth smelled faintly of iron and damp wood. His flashlight caught the faintest smear of something dark along the boards. He froze, the memory of Diego's death pressing like a weight against his chest. But then Ranger growled, deep and certain, and all of Herrera's focus sharpened. This was not Diego's trail. This was Noah's. And Miguel Herrera, haunted, relentless, driven by ghosts, was not about to let this boy become another name, whispered in grief. He rose, shoulders squared, determination cutting through him like a blade. "Lead on, Ranger." The shepherd lunged forward again, pulling him deeper into the maze of alleys and rusted fences. The ghost of his brother followed close behind, but this time Herrera felt something different. Not just guilt, not just loss, resolve, the kind that made a man stare down the darkness of a city and dare it to take another child. Not tonight. Not Noah. The broken guitar lay across Herrera's lap like a body rescued too late. Its wood was split, strings snarled, the neck barely holding together. Even in ruin, it still carried the shape of Noah's hope. Ranger sat rigid at his side, ears pinned forward, his steady breath loud in the silence that stretched across the abandoned park. Herrera lifted his flashlight, angling the beam carefully across the surface of the guitar. At first, he expected to see only scratches, dirt, the bruises of neglect. But as the light caught the frets, something else revealed itself. Tiny, irregular flecks, clinging to the wood. They glistened, faintly, brown-red, against the pale surface. He drew in a breath, his chest tightening. Blood. The air seemed to contract around him. He had seen enough crime scenes in his life to recognize the truth immediately. It wasn't much, not a pool, not a stain that screamed of death, but the kind of subtle, scattered drops that spoke of struggle. A scraped knee, a cut hand, a boy pulled from his world into fear. Elena stood nearby, wringing her hands together, her body trembling. She noticed the change in his face before he spoke. "What is it?" Her voice cracked, sharp with dread. Herrera hesitated, weighing the words. He had always believed in truth, but truth was often a blade. "There are traces here." He angled the light again, showing her the specks on the guitar's keys. Her gasp tore through the night. She stumbled forward, dropping to her knees in the dirt. "No, Elena." Herrera crouched beside her, his voice low, measured. "Listen to me. If it were worse, there would be more. This is small. He's hurt, yes. But this tells me he's alive. He was here, and he left this behind." Her eyes locked on the blood, wide and swimming with tears. "He was playing. He must have been playing when they—" She couldn't finish. Her hand covered her mouth as sobs broke loose, harsh and shaking. Ranger whined softly, moving closer, pressing his muzzle against her arm, as though reminding her that she wasn't alone in this moment. Herrera kept the flashlight steady, letting the truth remain visible, undeniable. "This isn't the end," he said firmly. "This is proof. Proof he fought. Proof he's still out there." The words were meant for her, but he felt them in his bones too. They steadied him, anchored him against the ghost of his own brother's loss. Eleanor reached trembling fingers toward the guitar. For a moment, she hovered, afraid to touch it, as if the broken wood might shatter further beneath her hand. Then she gathered it into her arms, pressing it tight against her chest. "My baby," she whispered, rocking slightly. "Mi niño. Noah." The sound of her grief cut through the night air, sharp enough that even the neighbors who had lingered at the edge of the park bowed their heads. Some murmured prayers, some simply turned away, unable to watch a mother cradle the last thing her child had left behind. Herrera let her hold it, let her weep into the broken strings, but his eyes remained on Ranger. The dog's posture had shifted again, nose pressed low, body quivering with readiness. He was waiting for the signal to move, to follow the trail that clung to the guitar like a whisper. "Elena," Herrera said gently, touching her shoulder. "We can't stop here. Ranger has the scent. He's telling us there's more to find. We have to let him lead." She shook her head, clutching the guitar tighter. "It smells like him," she said through sobs. "I can feel him still on it. It's all I have." Herrera swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking deep. "I know. But think about what Noah would want. He left this here, maybe without a choice. But Ranger can use it. This can guide us to him. Holding on to it won't save him. Letting us use it might." Her body stilled. Slowly, with fingers reluctant as if prying loose her own heart, she lifted the guitar from her chest. She kissed the splintered wood once, tears falling onto its surface, before placing it back into Herrera's waiting hands. "Bring him home," she whispered. Herrera nodded, his jaw tight. "That's what we're going to do." He lowered the guitar toward Ranger, letting the shepherd press his nose against the broken strings. The dog inhaled deeply, then pulled back with a sharp bark, his body surging forward on the leash. His growl was fierce now, vibrating with purpose, demanding they follow. The crowd at the edge of the park shifted, whispers rippling through them. Fear still hung in the air, but something else threaded into it now. Urgency. Momentum. The fragile thread of hope tied to one dog's nose. Herrera rose, slinging the guitar carefully over his shoulder. His eyes swept across the darkened park, Then back to Elena, who stood hollow-eyed, her arms still curved as if cradling the instrument that was no longer there. "Stay with the neighbors," he told her gently. "We'll follow him." She nodded weakly, her lips trembling as she whispered her son's name again into the night. "Noah." The word hung in the air, fragile and aching, like the last note of a song. Herrera turned, flashlight beam steady, Ranger pulling hard at the lead. The guitar was heavy against his shoulder, not with weight, but with meaning. The boy's blood was on it. His voice had once lived inside it, and now it was the compass pointing the way forward. As they stepped out of the park and into the shadows of the city, Herrera's mind tightened around one single truth. Noah Carter was still alive. The blood spoke it, faint but undeniable, and as long as that truth remained, he would not stop, not until the little sparrow's song was heard again. Behind them, Eleanor's sobs softened into whispers. She held herself upright on trembling legs, her eyes locked on the path Ranger had taken, as if sheer will might carry her son back along that trail. In the distance, the shepherd barked again, the sound fierce, unyielding. It echoed through the empty streets, carrying the weight of a vow neither man nor dog would break. The city at night carried its own silence, uneasy, brittle, filled with the hum of wires and the distant growl of cars. In Detroit's forgotten corners, silence was never safety. It was a cover, and Herrera knew too well that somewhere in that quiet, a boy was waiting. Ranger pressed his nose to the broken guitar once more, nostrils flaring, then surged forward. The leash snapped taut, nearly pulling Herrera off balance. The shepherd moved with the precision of instinct, muscles rippling beneath his coat, tail rigid, ears pricked like radar. "Stay close," Herrera ordered the two officers at his back. "He's on to something." They moved together, swallowed by shadows, their flashlights sweeping graffiti-stained walls and sagging fences. Ranger pulled them deeper, growling when Herrera tried to slow him, his paws scraping dirt, concrete, and broken asphalt. Every sound carried menace. A bottle rolling across pavement, a single light stuttering between glow and dark, a siren fading into nothing. Herrera's jaw tightened. He had walked these streets for years, but tonight every detail cut sharper. This wasn't just a city, it was a maze. And at its center was a boy whose song had been stolen. Ranger stopped suddenly at a toppled trash bin, sniffing hard. A faint smear marked the concrete. Not blood, but the shoeprint of a child. Noah's. "He came through here," Herrera said tightly. The shepherd lunged forward, dragging them past a chain-link fence. Metal tore Herrera's sleeve as he slipped through, but Ranger barely slowed. They emerged into a narrower alley, where mildew clung thick to the air. Rats scurried, shadows shifted. Still, Ranger pressed on, threading them through the city's forgotten passageways with unerring focus. Herrera crouched when Ranger clawed at rusted sheet metal. A thread of fabric clung to the wire, child-sized. He pocketed it, voice steady. "We're on the right path." Beyond the fence, abandoned buildings loomed, windows shattered, sidewalks split by weeds. Ranger's pace quickened, frantic now. The scent was fresh. Herrera's chest tightened. "Stay sharp," he warned. "If he's close, so are they." The shepherd lunged again, barking into the gloom. His claws scraped stone, desperate to break free of the leash. Herrera let him lead, heart hammering. Then the alley spilled into a forgotten lot cluttered with weeds and broken furniture. Ranger froze, body stiff, teeth bared. Herrera swept his light. Nothing, only silence and wreckage. But he trusted Ranger more than his own eyes. The scent was strong here. The trail was alive. "Good boy," he murmured, hand firm on the dog's shoulder. Keep leading. Ranger barked once, sharp, and tore deeper into the district, but scent alone wouldn't be enough. The city buried its secrets well, and sometimes its people carried the truth. Herrera slowed Ranger, then approached the figures emerging from porches and doorways, drawn by flashlights and the shepherd's barks. "What did you see?" he asked evenly. At first, silence. The kind born of fear, not ignorance. People here survived by keeping their heads down. Finally, a grizzled man muttered, "Old Ford van, paint peeling, parked by the playground after midnight." "Who was inside?" "Windows blacked out. I stayed maybe half an hour. Didn't want to know more." A woman called from her porch, voice wavering. "That van's been here before. Always at night. My sister saw two men once. Hoods up, faces hidden." Murmurs spread, threads of rumor tightening into dread. Herrera raised a hand. Slowly, one at a time, he turned to the woman. "What were they doing?" "Just watching," she admitted. "Standing by the swings, like they were waiting." Another voice cut sharp. "We all knew something was wrong, but cops don't come here unless it's too late." Herrera didn't flinch. "Listen, this isn't just another patrol. A 9-year-old boy is missing. The one you called the Little Sparrow. You know him." Faces shifted. Even the silent ones lowered their eyes, guilt flickering. "If you've seen that van, if you've noticed anyone unusual, you need to tell me now. Every minute we stay quiet is another minute farther he's taken from his mother." This silence was different, weighted with conscience. An older woman stepped down, clutching her shawl. "I heard voices last night, men laughing. Then, a sound, heavy. I didn't look." "Thank you," Herrera said softly. Ranger sniffed at her steps, confirming. Then another word spread like a curse. "Traffickers." It slipped out, and once spoken, the street changed. Faces twisted with anger and fear. Whispers rippled. Vans, hooded men, children gone. Herrera lifted his voice. "Rumors don't save children. Facts do. Did anyone catch a plate number? A dent? Anything?" Heads shook. Enough to stir terror, not enough to act. Still, it was something. Herrera crouched beside Ranger. "We'll cut through the noise," he whispered. The shepherd whined, pulling toward the deeper alleys. The trail was thin but unbroken. Herrera straightened. "You've helped tonight, but if you see that van again, don't whisper. Call. Noah's life depends on it." Some nodded, some shrank back into shadows, but a flicker lingered in their eyes. Fear might not win so easily next time. Herrera gave Ranger the signal. The shepherd barked once, sharp, and dragged them on. The night stretched long, darkness seeping into bones. Herrera's light cut the gloom, but Ranger truly lit the path. The shepherd was electrified now, body taut, eyes blazing, barking into shadows as though daring them to yield. "He's telling us we're close," Herrera warned. Abandoned storefronts leaned like drunks, rusted cars rotted in gutters. Ranger lunged right into a lane overgrown with weeds. He stopped, nose pressed hard to the ground, then barked savagely. Herrera crouched, hand steady on his back. "You smell him, don't you?" Ranger clawed the pavement, frantic, then surged ahead. The buildings grew denser, shadows heavier. A curtain flickered in an upper window. Herrera noted it but didn't pause. Ranger barreled forward, barking with raw desperation, echoing Elena's plea. "If you hear me, Noah, sing." Then he stopped dead. The leash went rigid. Ranger's body stiffened, teeth bared, growl deep and primal. He faced the shadow of a house, if it could still be called that. Windows boarded with rotting plywood, roof sagging, paint stripped to bone. Less of a home than a tombstone. And before it, an iron gate. Rusted, chained, thick enough to hold back a storm. Ranger lunged, snarling, paws striking sparks on the bars. He scratched until his pads bled, barking with a ferocity that echoed through the night. The officers froze, their lights darting nervously. "Detective, you think—" "I don't think," Herrera cut in, his eyes locked on the shepherd. "I know. He's telling us." Each bark was a command, a plea, an accusation. Herrera pressed a hand to the cold iron, feeling the weight beyond it. Life held captive. "Noah, call it in," he ordered. "Get backup, tools to cut this lock." As radios crackled, Herrera crouched beside his partner. His voice dropped, fierce and steady. "Good boy, you found him." Ranger pressed his muzzle against the bars, body trembling, barking hoarse but relentless. The night grew heavier, silence thicker, as if the city itself was waiting. Behind the chain, the house loomed, rotting, silent, but alive with secrets. Somewhere inside, a boy's song waited to rise again. And nothing, not rust, not chains, not shadows, would stop them now. The abandoned house loomed like a carcass, its porch sagging, windows sealed with grey boards, paint stripped to bone. The iron gate still rattled from Ranger's assault, and Herrera's hand throbbed where he'd gripped the bars. Backup had arrived. 2 more patrol cars, lights dimmed. Officers fanned across the street, radios whispering. Neighbors stopped at a distance, clutching each other, whispering prayers. They felt it too. Something lived inside this house. Something wrong and breathing. The bolt cutters snapped the lock, the echo ringing like a gunshot. Ranger lunged through first, dragging Herrera across the withered yard. His growl was low, constant, vibrating through the leash like a drumbeat. He pulled them to the side of the house, where broken boards and rusted tools hid a patch of earth. Herrera's light swept the pile. Beneath it, a slab of iron mottled with rust. A hatch. Chains looped across it, padlocked tight. Ranger clawed at the metal, sparks scraping off his nails, his body shaking with fury. Herrera crouched, pressed a hand to the hatch. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, faintly, he felt it. A vibration. Not movement, not words. Presence. "There's someone down there," he said. The officers froze. Ranger barked, muzzle jammed against the seam. Herrera's chest tightened at Elena's remembered whisper. "If you hear me, Noah, sing. Get cutters. A bar. Now." One officer ran to the squad car. The others fixed their beams on the hatch, light trembling. Ranger's claws scraped blood from his pads, but he didn't stop. His whole body demanded, "Open it." The cutters bit through the padlock. The chains clattered aside. Herrera wedged the crowbar into the seam and pressed down until the hinges shrieked. A foul breath of damp, rust, and mildew rose as the hatch shifted. The smell dragged Herrera into old memories. Cold rooms, broken families, Diego's face swallowed by water. He shoved it down. Ranger barked so loud it split the night. His nose jammed against the widening crack, whining desperately. Herrera leaned close, his beam cutting into a stairwell crumbling with age, walls slick with moisture. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. Then, faint, fragile, trembling, came a sound. A note. Herrera froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Another note followed, uneven, then another, stitching a broken melody together. A child's song, cracked by sobs, but alive. "Noah," Herrera whispered. The boy's voice wove fragments of a hymn, words fractured but recognizable. "Downstream. Carry my voice." His voice broke, then rose again, stubborn. Not for beauty, but survival. Ranger whined, ears sharp, muzzle snapping toward the stairwell. He barked, the sound echoing into the dark. The song faltered, then steadied. An answer. Herrera's throat tightened. He thought of Elena begging, "If you hear me, Noah, sing." And here it was. A boy's song, rising from the dark like a prayer. He leaned closer, voice steady. "Noah, this is Detective Herrera. We hear you. Keep singing, son. Don't stop." The officers behind him froze, reverent. Hardened men recognized something sacred in the trembling voice. Ranger pawed the ground, desperate to leap. Herrera steadied him with a hand. "He's doing his part. Let him guide us." The melody grew a fraction stronger, fueled by the knowledge someone was listening. A whisper broke inside it. "Mom." Herrera swallowed hard, vision blurring. He pressed the leash tight. "He's alive," he murmured. "And we're going to get him out." The hatch gaped only inches, rust clinging stubbornly to its frame. "We're going in," Herrera ordered. "Tools, now." A sledgehammer slammed down, rattling iron and earth. Rust burst into the air. Noah's voice faltered at the noise, then returned, thinner but steady. "Again." The hammer rose and fell, each strike punctuated by Ranger's snarls. The hatch bent, groaned, and resisted. Herrera clenched his fists, every second dragging like a knife. Finally, with a violent crack, the hinges tore free. The hatch slammed aside, a gust of air rushing upward. Stale, mold, sweat, decay. The stench of captivity. Noah's song cut off. "Noah!" Herrera shouted, voice booming down the stairwell. "It's Miguel Herrera. We're here. Keep singing." For a heartbeat, silence. Then, faint, breaking, came the reply. A quivering note. A child's defiance against the dark. Relief surged through Herrera, so fierce it staggered him. He turned to his men, weapons ready, flashlights steady. This isn't just a rescue. It's a confrontation. The officers drew, pale but resolute. Ranger lunged at the opening, nearly dragging Herrera with him. His growl thundered, eyes burning. Herrera leaned close, whispering, "One more second, partner. Then you lead." The shepherd quivered, barely contained. Herrera looked at the team. "Form up. Quiet. Our priority is the boy." They nodded, steel in their faces now. He thought of Elena, still waiting blocks away, her arms empty. Of Diego, the brother he couldn't save. And of Noah, who had kept his promise. "I'll sing so loud you'll always find me." He raised his light to the yawning stairwell. The smell of iron and damp rose like a curse. Then he gave the command. "Move." Ranger charged first, barking so savagely it shook the night. Herrera followed, flashlight cutting through black, his hand firm on the leash, the other steady on his weapon. Officers fell in behind, beams slicing thin swords of light across the damp walls. The stairwell swallowed them whole. The night outside shrank to a whisper. The hatch slammed back into place with a hollow echo, sealing them into the earth. And beneath the dripping stone, Noah's trembling song carried on, a fragile beacon guiding them deeper into the dark. The stairwell groaned beneath their boots as Herrera led the descent, his flashlight cutting through suffocating black. The walls closed tight, wet with condensation, air thick with mildew and iron. Each breath scraped his lungs. Behind him, 2 officers moved in silence, weapons drawn, while Ranger strained at the leash, every muscle taut, a growl thrumming in his chest. The boy's voice drifted from below, a faint hum, trembling, broken by shallow gasps, exhausted, but alive. "Keep singing, Noah," Herrera whispered, though the boy likely couldn't hear. "We're almost there." At the bottom, his light swept a damp concrete floor, littered with glass and cigarette butts, then across walls bruised with rot. The beam caught a chair, small shoulders, bound wrists, a bowed head. Noah. Herrera's breath caught. "There," he rasped. The boy flinched in the light, his humming faltering. Slowly, his head lifted. Tear-streaked eyes blinked against the glare, fearful, yet sparking faintly at the sight of them. "Noah," Herrera said softly, steadying his voice. "It's Detective Herrera. You're safe now." Ranger barked once, sharp. Noah's gaze snapped to the shepherd. His lips trembled, then broke into the faintest, fragile smile. "Dog," he croaked. "Mama's dog." "Yes," Herrera murmured. "He's here for you." Ranger surged forward, desperate to reach him. Herrera held tight. "Not yet, boy. Let me clear it first." His beam swept the room's shadows. A blinking camera on a tripod, a table scattered with tape and cords, a whip leaning against the wall. Herrera's gut twisted. He crouched low, meeting Noah's glassy stare. "We're going to get you out." The boy's lips cracked with a whisper. "Sasang, so Mama could hear." Herrera's throat burned. "She did, son. And so did we." Ranger whined, ears forward, eyes locked on the boy like a sentinel. Even the officers murmured at the intensity. Herrera rose, signaling, "Cover me." He cut the tape from Noah's wrists and ankles. The boy whimpered, raw skin peeling, but his hands reached blindly until they found Ranger's fur. The shepherd pressed close, whining in relief. Sobs broke from Noah, yet the humming threaded on between them. Not song anymore. Survival. Herrera lifted him gently. Noah's body was feather-light, trembling like a bird too long in a cage. His face pressed into Herrera's shoulder, humming muffled, but alive. Ranger circled them, barking once, protective. For a moment, it felt finished, until Ranger froze. His growl rumbled deep, vibrating the air. His body stiffened, ears flat, teeth bared. "Take him," Herrera ordered sharply, passing Noah to an officer. The boy whimpered, clutching his sleeve until Ranger pressed his muzzle against the child's hand. Only then did Noah release, though fear cracked his voice. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Wiry frame, hollow cheeks, greasy hair plastered to his face. In one hand, a whip dangled loosely. His lips curled into a smirk. "Silas Ward," Herrera growled. The man gave a mocking bow. "Detective. Took you long enough to follow the sparrow's song." His voice rasped with cruelty. Noah whimpered. "That's him. He made me sing." Silas's gaze flicked to the boy, eyes gleaming with twisted pride. "Quite a gift you've got, Noah. The world ignored me, but it listens to little sparrows. Their voices endure." He gestured at the blinking camera. Herrera's stomach turned. He wasn't just exploiting children. He was recording them, feeding their pain to an unseen audience. Put it down, Herrera ordered, gun raised. It's over. Silas laughed hollowly. Over? This is only the second act. The whip cracked, splitting the air. Noah flinched, crying out. Ranger lunged, barely restrained, snarling like thunder caged. Herrera held firm. Not yet, Silas sneered. Every sparrow sings its last note. I will decide when. Herrera's voice sharpened. Not tonight. Tonight, you're done. For a heartbeat, the chamber froze. Guns drawn, whip raised, Ranger trembling like a coiled spring. Then Noah whispered, Mama. The sound shattered the silence. Ranger exploded forward, bark erupting like a gunshot. Now! Herrera roared. The whip cracked. Ranger intercepted mid-swing, jaws clamping onto Silas's arm. The predator shrieked, staggering as the shepherd's weight drove him against the wall. The whip clattered away, silenced. Move in, Herrera commanded. Officers surged. Chaos erupted. Flashlights darting, shouts colliding with Ranger's snarls and Silas's screams. The man thrashed, clawing, but the shepherd held fast, his growl vibrating like judgment itself. Herrera pressed close, weapon trained. Hold him! Officers seized Silas's limbs, wrenching him down. Handcuffs snapped shut with a final metallic click. Silas sagged, spitting defiance through clenched teeth. The song never dies. Ranger loomed inches from his throat, eyes burning, refusing to yield even as Herrera murmured, That's enough, boy. Slowly the shepherd released, returning to Herrera's side, gaze locked on the predator. Silas was dragged toward the stairs, muttering curses, his whip abandoned. Herrera turned back. Noah stumbled free of an officer's arms and collapsed against Ranger, wrapping his small arms around the dog's neck. The shepherd lowered his head, pressing close, tail flicking once in reassurance. Herrera knelt beside them, brushing Noah's tangled hair. You're safe. He can't hurt you anymore. The boy sobbed into Ranger's fur. I kept singing, so Mama would hear me. Herrera's voice broke. She did, son. And now we're taking you home. As they climbed back toward the hatch, Noah's humming returned. Soft, fragile, but no longer for survival. It was a song about being found. Ranger barked once into the night, chest swelling, his voice triumphant. And Herrera knew it wasn't just victory, it was a declaration. The predator was unmasked. The child was saved. The sparrow would sing again. The chamber felt strangely hollow, now that Silas Ward had been dragged away in cuffs. His curses faded into the stairwell, swallowed by the damp stone. What remained was the echo of Ranger's snarls and the fragile thread of Noah's trembling breath. The danger was over, but the boy was still bound, duct tape biting into his wrists and ankles, cruel remnants of captivity. Detective Herrera knelt again, flashlight steady. The beam revealed the raw truth. Skin rubbed red, blistered, small flecks of dried blood, where Noah had fought too long against the restraints. Noah, Herrera said softly, his chest tight, though his voice remained calm. We're going to take this off now. You're safe. The boy's wide eyes flicked between him and the shepherd standing guard. His lips moved, whispering something so faint, Herrera almost missed it. What was that, son? He leaned closer. Don't let him come back. Herrera swallowed hard, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. He's not coming back. The ranger made sure of that. And so did we. See him? The dog stood inches away, chest heaving, amber eyes locked on the stairwell. He won't let anyone hurt you again. Ranger whined softly, lowering his muzzle until it brushed Noah's taped hands. A shaky sob escaped the boy as his fingers twitched, trying to pet the dog despite the tape. Herrera drew his knife, careful, deliberate. "I'm cutting the tape now. Stay very still." Noah nodded, though his whole body trembled. The blade slid under the first strip. The tape clung stubbornly, pulling at raw flesh until the boy flinched and whimpered. I know, Herrera murmured. Almost there. The final snap came free, curling in his hand. Noah's wrist fell limp, shaking violently, welts vivid across his skin. "Good job," Herrera whispered. One more. The second wrist came free slower, the boy crying softly but refusing to pull away. When it dropped into his lap, his hands trembled like fallen leaves. "Can you move your fingers?" Herrera asked. Noah lifted them weakly, wiggling just enough before breaking into sobs. Herrera pulled him into his arms. The child collapsed against him, shaking violently, face buried in his chest. The sound that came out was neither a sob nor a breath, but something in between. The sound of hours spent in fear, of songs sung through tears. "You're okay," Herrera whispered, holding him close. "I've got you now." Ranger pressed against both, his warmth grounding the fragile reunion. He nuzzled Noah's shoulder, licking his wet cheek. "Detective, his ankles," one officer said softly. Herrera nodded, laying Noah back into the chair. The boy clung desperately until Ranger pressed close again, offering something solid to hold. "Stay with him," Herrera whispered to the dog. Ranger instantly lowered himself at the boy's feet, eyes fixed on him. The tape around the ankles was tighter, the skin beneath raw and swollen. Herrera's knife worked carefully, fury burning in his chest at what had been done. When the last strip fell, Noah gasped, lifting his legs as if unsure they still belonged to him. Ranger rested his head across them, promising protection, even for wounds he couldn't heal. The boy's fingers curled weakly into the shepherd's fur. Herrera crouched once more, meeting his gaze. "You're free now, Noah. Do you understand? The chains are gone. You're safe." Tears welled again, his lip quivering. "I sang for Mama, so she would find me." Herrera blinked hard. "She heard you, and the ranger heard you. That song saved you." Noah leaned forward, pressing his forehead into the shepherd's fur. "Good dog." Ranger's tail thumped once, solemn. Herrera lifted the boy into his arms, light as air. Noah clung to him, humming again, faint, fractured, but no longer born of fear. It was all he knew to tether himself to life. "You don't have to sing alone anymore," Herrera murmured. "We're here." The officers around them stood in quiet respect. They all knew. Sometimes chains were more than tape. Tonight, both kinds had been broken. As Herrera climbed toward the faint light above, Ranger pressed close, daring the shadows to try again. Outside, the street was alive with flashing lights and hushed prayers. Neighbors pressed against barricades, pale with fear. Radios crackled, boots scuffed pavement, but all stilled when Elena Carter broke through. Her face was drawn, eyes wide with desperate hope. She stumbled forward, clutching her coat like it was the only thing holding her together. "Elena," Herrera called softly. She froze as he emerged, Noah cradled in his arms, Ranger at his side. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that sight. Her son alive, bruised and trembling, but breathing. Her cry split the night. "Noah!" The boy stirred, whispering hoarsely. "Mama." Herrera lowered him into her arms, She collapsed to her knees on the pavement, clutching him so tightly, it seemed she might never let go. Noah clung back, whispering into her ear with trembling lips, "I sang, so Mama could find me." Her sobs deepened. She kissed his cheeks, his wrists, as though trying to erase every mark. "I heard you. Every night. You never stopped calling for me." Noah's faint smile broke through exhaustion. "I knew you'd come." She rocked him, repeating through tears, "I'm here. I'm here." Ranger pressed against them, muzzle brushing Noah's side. The boy touched his fur, whispering, "He found me." Herrera's voice broke quietly. "Not me. Him. He followed your boy's song." The shepherd gave a soft whine, leaning into the boy's weak hand. Neighbors wept openly, whispering prayers. One old man murmured, "The little sparrow's song brought him home." Medics arrived with a stretcher. Elena resisted at first, but Noah stirred, whispering, "Mama, it's okay." Only then did she allow them to lift him, never letting go of his hand. Ranger walked beside the stretcher, every step protective. At the ambulance, the shepherd pressed his muzzle against Noah's cheek, licking tears away with a tenderness that quieted even the medics. The boy wrapped trembling arms around his neck, clutching him like an anchor. The medics exchanged glances. One said softly, "Let the dog ride with him. It may do more good than anything we can." Herrera nodded. "He'll stay." As Noah was lifted into the ambulance, Ranger leapt in, settling across his chest, ears twitching, gaze never leaving the boy's face. Noah's breathing steadied. His fingers tangled in fur. Elena climbed in, forehead pressed to her son's temple. "Rest now. You don't have to sing anymore. Mama's here." But even as sleep claimed him, a faint hum slipped from Noah's lips. Ranger whined softly, pressing closer, as if to say, "I hear you. I always will." Herrera stood at the doors, finally exhaling. The night had been heavy with horror, but one truth cut through. A child's song, sung in darkness, had carried him back to the light. The doors closed gently, sealing the boy, his mother, and his guardian shepherd inside. For the first time, silence felt not suffocating, but sacred. The basement was quiet now, save for the drip of water from a leaking pipe and the scuff of boots on concrete. Noah was gone, carried into the ambulance with Ranger pressed at his side. Elena had followed, her sobs softening into whispers of relief. But Herrera remained, standing in the cold chamber that had nearly stolen a boy's voice forever. Without Silas Ward, the room felt emptier but darker, as if the shadows themselves carried secrets. Herrera swept his light across the damp stone walls. The stench of sweat and iron clung to the air, but beneath it was something fouler, something calculated. "Detective?" an officer called from the far wall. "You'll want to see this." Herrera's boots crunched over glass as he joined him. The flashlight beam caught a dented hard drive on the floor, wires trailing like veins. Two more lay stacked beside a tripod. The camera's red light still blinked. Herrera's chest tightened. He'd seen setups like this before, dark spaces turned into theaters of cruelty. But the sheer number of drives chilled him. Each one wasn't just evidence. Each one was a stolen voice. "Bag them," he ordered, clipped. "Don't touch the ports. Cybercrime will have them by morning." The crackle of evidence bags filled the silence. Herrera swept his beam again. Against the wall, coils of rope, rolls of duct tape, and a notepad smeared with ink. He lifted it carefully. Across the pages, names. Some crossed out, others are marked with dates. His stomach turned. This wasn't his first, he said, voice low, and it wouldn't have been his last. Silence fell. Then one officer spoke the truth they all feared. This isn't just some loner, is it? Herrera shook his head. He was broadcasting. That camera wasn't for him. Someone was watching. Maybe hundreds. The tripod's eye blinked until an officer shut it off with a sharp click. The thought lingered heavy. Somewhere out there, faceless viewers had been tuned in, watching a child suffer. And the moment they breached this place, those viewers scattered like rats. Get forensics, Herrera ordered. Every fingerprint, every fiber. This room rots one more day. We lose them. Flashlights swept. Markers clicked open. Cameras flashed. The chamber transformed from a lair of horror into a crime scene. Herrera's light caught the whip Ward had dropped. He crouched, jaw tight. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a theater. And Ward hadn't built it alone. He rose, radio in hand. Confirmed multiple drives, camera setup, ledger. This case isn't isolated. Repeat. This is a ring. The reply crackled back. Copy. FBI liaison notified. Task force incoming. Herrera lowered the radio, his grip tight. The scope pressed down on him like weight. Noah's song had led them here, but how many songs had gone unheard? Sir, another officer said, holding up a drive. Words scrawled in marker glared back. Sparrow. Herrera's chest ached. Rage burned, but he swallowed it. We're shutting this down. Every last one. No more sparrows lost in the dark. Ranger padded forward, sniffing the drives and ropes, growl low and constant. Herrera pressed a hand to his back. We'll make it right, boy. For him. For all of them. He looked once more at the chair where Noah had been bound. Tape still curled and stiff, spotted with blood. Not just evidence, but a reminder. He whispered under his breath. He sang his way back. Others deserve the chance. Finally, he turned toward the stairs. Bag everything. Tonight was a rescue. Tomorrow, it's a war. Ranger followed, his steady steps echoing that vow. By dawn, Detroit was awake. Headlines blared. 9-year-old rescued from underground dungeon. Photos of the boarded house, police tape fluttering, filled every screen. The phrase, "singing to survive," trended across platforms. Elena's name appeared in every article. The boy's mother who told him to keep singing. Reporters repeated her whispered plea. If you hear me, Noah, sing. And there was a ranger. Images of the shepherd pressed against Noah's stretcher flooded the news. Anchors choked back tears describing him as Detroit's guardian. Clips of him nuzzling Noah's cheek replayed again and again. But alongside awe, outrage grew. The discovery of cameras and ledgers leaked quickly. This wasn't one predator. It was a network. Protests sparked by afternoon. Signs rose outside precincts and City Hall. Protect our children. No more silence. Listen to the sparrows. In the Carter neighborhood, silence gave way to defiance. Neighbors, once afraid, opened doors, leaving food and prayers at Elena's porch. Children drew sparrows and German shepherds, taping them to the front door. Strangers placed flowers. Exhausted, Eleanor stepped outside briefly. She gripped the railing, pale but resolute. Dozens of faces waited below. Her lips trembled. Thank you for not giving up on him. Applause erupted. Someone began a hymn. Soon voices joined together. filling the block with song. Inside, Noah stirred. Pressed against Ranger's side, he whispered faintly, "They're singing for me." The shepherd licked his cheek, anchoring him back to rest. From the street, Herrera watched quietly. He declined interviews, letting the department issue statements. But when a reporter shouted, "Detective, what do you say to those calling Ranger a hero?" he finally answered. His gaze found the shepherd lying guard on the porch. "They're right." He followed the song when the rest of us only heard silence. The soundbite replayed on every evening broadcast. By nightfall, the city was restless. Protest chants echoed downtown. News vans lined the street. But Noah's hospital room was still. The boy slept beneath a thin blanket, hands wrapped in gauze. His fingers twitched now and then, as if still strumming an invisible guitar. Ranger lay at his side, muzzle on the mattress, amber eyes alert even in stillness. Elena sat slumped in a chair, her hand circling Noah's wrist even in sleep. She refused to let go. Herrera lingered in the doorway. He had stood in precincts for years, seen darkness wear many faces. But tonight it felt heavier. The ledger in his coat pocket pressed against him like a stone. He stepped closer. Ranger's eyes tracked him instantly. Herrera crouched, pressing a hand to the dog's neck. "Good boy," he whispered. "You did more than any of us tonight." Ranger's tail tapped once, quiet acknowledgement. Herrera's gaze turned to Noah. Even asleep, his lips moved faintly as if still humming. A voice refusing to die. Herrera's throat tightened. He thought of Diego, his own silence years ago, a vow made in grief. Tonight proved vows weren't enough. They needed to be louder, fiercer. Leaning close, he whispered as though speaking into the boy's dreams. "Noah, you'll never be silenced again. You sang, and it led us here. Now it will lead us further." The boy stirred faintly, Elena's hand tightening protectively even in sleep. Herrera's voice stayed low, steady. "There are more out there. More sparrows whose songs were stolen. Ranger and I, we'll find them. We'll bring them home." The shepherd lifted his head, amber eyes glowing in the lamplight. Herrera rubbed his ear. "You and me, partner. We started this. We'll finish it." The door opened. An officer stepped in, hushed. "Detective Command wants you at the precinct by morning. Cybercrime says it's bigger than we thought." Herrera nodded. "I'll be there." The officer hesitated, glancing at Noah. "Kid's lucky. Most don't make it out of places like that." Herrera's jaw tightened. Luck had nothing to do with it. He fought. He sang. And the ranger listened. The officer left. The room returned to quiet. The mother's hand, the boy's faint hum, the dog's steady breathing. Survival had taken shape here, fragile but real. Herrera lingered one last moment. He bent close, words for boy and dog alike. "Rest now. Tomorrow the fight begins, but you'll never sing alone in the dark again." Ranger pressed his head against Herrera's leg, a soldier's salute. Herrera touched his back, then turned to the hall, carrying the vow with him. The shepherd returned his muzzle to the mattress, eyes fixed on Noah. The boy's breath slowed, humming and fading into sleep. Elena's fingers curled tighter around his wrist, and somewhere beyond the walls, the ledger waited. Names on paper, songs silenced. The fight had only just begun. The days that followed blurred together in antiseptic air and fluorescent light. The hospital smelled of bleach and gauze, every corridor echoing with monitors and hurried footsteps. Yet, in room 314, time slowed. Noah Carter was alive, but survival left quiet burdens. His small body bore the marks of captivity, raw wrists and ankles, fading bruises, a chest that rose shallow in sleep. Nurses charted his healing body, but none of their graphs could capture the shadows in his eyes. He rarely spoke. Instead, he hummed, soft, fragile threads of melody that drifted between silence and sobs. It was no longer the joyful song of a boy on his porch. It was fractured, like glass that might break if touched too roughly. Elena never left his side. She fed him spoonfuls of soup, brushed his tangled hair, whispered lullabies she hadn't sung in years. Sometimes Noah smiled faintly. Sometimes he only turned his face toward her voice, clinging to it like a lifeline. And always there was Ranger. Though hospital rules forbade animals, an exception was made when staff saw the boy's panic ease at the shepherd's steps. Ranger padded in, amber gaze steady, tail swishing gently. Noah's trembling hand reached for him, and when his face pressed into the shepherd's neck, something in him softened. Ranger climbed carefully onto the bed and laid his head across Noah's lap. From then on, he never left. When nightmares jolted Noah awake, Ranger pressed against his chest until breathing steadied. When nurses cleaned wounds, the shepherd stood guard, his calm presence holding the boy in the present. Even in restless sleep, Noah's hand remained tangled in his fur, as if letting go meant the darkness might return. Doctors called Ranger medicine we can't prescribe. Herrera saw him differently, not comfort alone, but a bridge. The boy who sang to survive was learning to live again, carried across by the steady presence of a dog. On the 5th day, Noah finally spoke more than a whisper. Elena had been humming an old lullaby. He lifted his eyes, voice hoarse but certain. "I sang, Mama. I sang so you would hear me." Her tears spilled as she gathered him close. "And I did, baby. Your song brought me back." Ranger licked his hand gently, affirming the truth. For the first time since the rescue, Noah smiled. By the 7th morning, the hospital felt less frantic. Noah sat propped against pillows, wrists wrapped in gauze, eyes often drifting toward the window where winter light pressed through blinds. He hadn't truly sung since the basement, only in sleep, when half-formed melodies escaped him. Awake, his voice stayed locked away. That morning, Herrera entered with a case tucked under his arm. He crouched by Noah's bed. "Hey, little sparrow. Got something for you." Inside lay a small guitar, wood-polished, strings gleaming. Not fancy, just new, untouched by cruelty. Noah stared, throat working, fingers twitching. Herrera spoke gently. "I know the last one carries dark memories, but this one's different. This one's for home, for healing." Elena brushed his hair. "Only if you're ready, baby. No one expects you to." The boy whispered, "What if I can't?" Herrera's tone was firm but kind. "Then you don't. But I think you can. And I think Ranger wants to hear you try." The shepherd lifted his head, pressing his muzzle against Noah's side. His tail thumped once. Noah's lips quivered. Slowly, hesitantly, he let his fingers brush the strings. The faint vibration startled him, and he pulled back. Herrera didn't push. That's all it takes. One touch at a time. Minutes passed. Then, trembling, Noah tried again. The note cracked, but it lived. He flinched, but Ranger leaned closer, steadying him. He strummed again. The sound was thin, uneven, but unmistakably music. His eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered. "No." Noah shook his head. "It's broken." Herrera leaned in. "No, it's alive. Just like you." The words lingered. Noah strummed again, letting the chord breathe. Then, with trembling lips, he opened his mouth. A sound emerged, cracked, fragile, but undeniably his voice. Not a song yet, just a note, but it was enough to draw tears down Elena's cheeks. The boy tried again. A line of melody broke free, faltering but steady. The room filled with the trembling rise of a child daring to sing again. Elena sobbed openly, Herrera's jaw clenched with grief and relief. Ranger pressed closer, his tail tapping in rhythm. When Noah stopped, breathless, he whispered, "It doesn't sound the same." Elena cupped his face. "It doesn't have to. It just has to be yours." Herrera added, "Voices change when they've been through fire. Sometimes they come out stronger." The boy nodded faintly. He strummed once more, softer now. For the first time since the basement, he wasn't singing to survive. He was singing because he chose to. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was expectant, like the pause before a new song begins. Weeks later, the Carter home filled with life again. For days, curtains had stayed drawn, visitors hushed. But on this evening, neighbors gathered outside. Children held paper sparrows. Parents carried candles. The block, once silenced by fear, now hummed with hope. Elena stood on the porch, arm around her son. Noah was still thin, pale, but his hands clutched the new guitar. At his feet, Ranger sat tall, ears pricked, eyes steady on the crowd. The murmurs hushed as Noah stepped forward. The porch boards creaked beneath him, the same spot where he used to sing freely. He looked out at the faces waiting, love and expectation shining back. His throat tightened. Elena bent close. "Only if you're ready, baby. They just want to hear you." Noah looked down at Ranger. The shepherd nudged his knee, tail swishing gently. "You can do this. I'm here." The boy drew a deep breath. His fingers pressed a chord. The first sound cracked, uneven, but carried. And then, with trembling lips, he began to sing. The voice was fragile, faltering in places, but it was his. The same voice that once drifted through alleys, that hummed in the dark to keep fear at bay, now rose into the open air of his neighborhood. Neighbors listened, some with hands pressed to mouths, others wiping tears. Children leaned into parents, sensing the weight. The song grew steadier, each note finding strength, like a bird testing its wings. Noah swayed slightly, eyes closed, carried by his own melody. Ranger pressed against his leg, head lifted proudly. To the crowd, it looked as though the dog was listening as intently as they were, not just to sound, but to tell a story. When the last note faded, silence lingered. Then applause erupted, wild, unrestrained, filled with tears and cheers. Some shouted his name, others cried, "Sing it again, Sparrow." Eleanor hugged her son, sobbing into his hair. "I'm so proud of you." Noah's eyes widened at the crowd's roar. Then, slowly, he smiled. Unguarded, radiant. His first true smile since the rescue. Ranger barked once, sharp and triumphant, tail wagging fiercely. At the street's edge, Herrera stood with hands in pockets. His face was unreadable, but inside, pride burned quietly. He thought of Diego, of the names in the ledger, of all the silenced songs. And for a moment, he believed this might be the first of many, the anthem of sparrows refusing silence. Then a neighbor began softly, an old gospel hymn. Others joined. Soon the block filled with harmony. Candles flickered, drawings rustled in the breeze, and in the center stood Noah with his guitar, Elena's arms around him, and Ranger pressed close. The boy's voice had returned. The block had its song again. And as night deepened, Detroit carried the echo beyond the neighborhood. A little sparrow had sung once more, and the world had listened. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and paper, the kind of air that had absorbed decades of whispers, verdicts, and broken promises. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, muted by dust, falling across polished benches, lined with people who had come to witness what many called the trial of the year. At the front, shackled and sullen, sat Silas Ward. His once smug expression had hardened into something colder, a mask he wore as if it could shield him from consequence. He kept his eyes low, hair slicked back but unkempt, his wrists bound in iron cuffs that clinked when he moved. Beside him sat 3 men and 1 woman, accomplices whose faces bore the same blend of defiance and fear. Together, they represented the rot that had festered behind closed doors, a network exposed by a boy's song and a dog's loyalty. On the opposite side, the prosecution spread out binders, laptops, and evidence bags, photos of hard drives, the camera, the ledger. They were ready, but everyone in the room knew the most powerful testimony wouldn't come from paper or technology. It would come from lived memory, from the voices of those who had carried scars. Elena sat in the first row, her hand firmly wrapped around Noah's smaller one. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back, but her eyes glistened with both exhaustion and strength. Noah, frail but healing, sat close, his small frame pressed against her. His wrists bore faint scars, his eyes still too old for his age, but he held himself upright. At his feet, Ranger lay stretched across the polished floor, his head resting between his paws, amber eyes tracking every sound, every movement, especially from the defense's table. The boy's other hand rested on the shepherd's back, steady, grounding. The sight silenced the room more than any gavel could. A child who had sung his way back from the dark, and the dog who had heard him. When the bailiff called Detective Miguel Herrera to the stand, the courtroom shifted. All eyes followed the man as he walked forward, his steps measured, his suit pressed but simple. He carried not just authority, but something heavier, memory. Herrera took his oath, sat, and fixed his gaze on the prosecutor. His voice was low but unwavering. "Detective," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court what led you to the discovery of Noah Carter?" Herrera nodded, his eyes briefly flicking toward the boy. "We had been searching for 48 hours. The trail was thin. Flyers, tips, desperation. But it was Ranger, my canine partner, who found the first real sign. He located Noah's guitar in a park. Blood was found on its keys. From there, Ranger followed a scent trail through alleys and abandoned blocks until we reached a house with a locked iron hatch." He paused, the memory pressing against him, the weight of that moment heavy still. From beneath that hatch, faintly, we heard singing, trembling, broken, but alive. That song led us to him. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Elena bowed her head, squeezing her son's hand, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Noah pressed closer to Ranger, whispering something only the shepherd seemed to hear. The prosecutor leaned closer. "And when you entered that chamber?" Herrera's jaw tightened. "We found Noah tied to a chair. He was humming still, his voice so faint it could barely carry. Behind him stood Silas Ward, armed with a whip, recording equipment running, prepared to continue what he called a performance." His voice hardened. It wasn't performance. It was torture, for an audience hidden on the dark web. Gasps rose from the gallery. One juror pressed a hand to her mouth. And how was Ward apprehended? Herrera's gaze shifted briefly to Ranger at Noah's feet. When Ward raised the whip, Ranger launched forward. He intercepted him, drove him back, and shielded the boy with his body. Officers restrained Ward, but it was Ranger who made sure Noah was never struck again. The shepherd's ears flicked at the sound of his name, his tail tapping once against the courtroom floor. Noah bent slightly, pressing his cheek against the dog's head, whispering, "Good boy." The prosecutor stepped back, satisfied. No further questions. The defense attorney rose, adjusting his glasses. His voice was sharper. "Detective Herrera, you speak of my client as though he acted alone, but you've also implied there is a wider network. Isn't it true you don't yet know the scope? Isn't it possible this was merely the act of one desperate man, not an organized ring?" Herrera's eyes narrowed, his voice cool. "No. The evidence shows multiple accomplices, ledgers with names, dozens of hard drives cataloging victims. My team and federal partners are already pursuing leads. Ward wasn't a loner. He was part of something bigger." The defense tried again, but Herrera didn't waver. Each question was met with clarity. Each attempt to blur responsibility answered with precision. His testimony wasn't just words. It was a vow, repeated before judge, jury, and city. At one point, the prosecutor asked the final, piercing question. "Detective, why did you keep searching when others said the trail had gone cold?" Herrera glanced again at Noah. His voice, steady but heavy with emotion, carried across the courtroom. "Because I lost a brother once. Because silence kills. And because I heard a boy singing in the dark, and I knew it was my duty to follow that song, until it brought him home." The room was silent. Even the judge paused, her gavel unused, her eyes softened. Elena wept quietly, her free hand pressed to her lips. Noah, cheeks wet with tears, whispered, "I knew you'd hear me." Ranger pressed closer against his legs, his amber eyes glowing like embers in the solemn light. By the time Herrera stepped down, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. A boy's song had become evidence, a mother's love had become testimony, and a dog's loyalty had become justice embodied. Silas Ward shifted in his chair, but the mask had cracked. For the first time, he avoided looking at the boy. The weight of truth had cornered him in a way no whip, no camera, no dark web audience ever could. When the session adjourned, people rose slowly, many brushing tears from their faces. Reporters scribbled furiously. But amid the noise, one image stayed steady. A child holding his mother's hand, a shepherd curled at his feet, and a detective walking away, his shoulders heavy, but his vow unbroken. The sparrow's song had reached the walls of justice, and it would echo there until every shadow was exposed. The spring morning carried a crispness that felt like renewal. The city had gathered in the plaza outside Detroit's municipal building, a wide space framed by brick facades and tall flagpoles. Rows of folding chairs lined the square, filled with neighbors, officers, and families who had followed the case since the night Noah disappeared. Television cameras stood at the edges, their red lights blinking, but the atmosphere was less about spectacle than reverence. Banners rippled gently from lampposts overhead. In bold letters they read, "Detroit's Guardian." Beneath the words was a printed image of a German shepherd, amber eyes sharp, body poised, forever immortalized as the dog who had followed a child's song through darkness. Ranger sat at the center of it all, a black and tan silhouette against the morning sun. His ears pricked, his chest proud, but his gaze steady, calm. On his harness gleamed a new patch stitched by the department. Valor in service. The shepherd didn't seem to notice the eyes on him, the applause rippling through the crowd. His focus, as always, stayed close to the people he loved. Elena, Herrera, and most of all, Noah. The boy stood beside him on the stage, small fingers entwined in the thick fur of his protector. He wore a simple shirt and jacket, his wrists still faintly marked, but his eyes brighter now. He had been nervous when Elena first brought him forward, but the moment Ranger leaned against his side, the trembling stopped. The police chief stepped to the podium, her voice carrying over the plaza. We gather today not only to honor Detective Miguel Herrera and the men and women who brought Noah Carter home, but to honor a partner who reminded us of the power of instinct, loyalty, and love. Ranger is more than a canine. He is a guardian, a hero, and a reminder that courage sometimes wears 4 paws and a steady gaze. The crowd erupted in applause. Some rose to their feet. Children waved small paper sparrows they had made in school, their wings fluttering in the breeze. Elena pressed a hand to her heart, tears brimming. Herrera, standing at the far side of the stage, lowered his head briefly, his lips tightening with quiet pride. An officer stepped forward holding a medal attached to a blue ribbon. He knelt before Ranger, fastening it carefully to the shepherd's harness. The medal glinted in the sunlight, catching the eyes of the crowd, who cheered louder. Ranger tilted his head slightly, as though puzzled by the attention, then barked once, sharp and clear, which only drew more laughter and tears. Through it all, Noah stayed close, his small hand never leaving the shepherd's fur. When the applause finally softened, he crouched beside Ranger, pressing his forehead against the dog's. The crowd watched, hushed now, as though sensing something sacred. Noah's lips moved, his voice barely more than a whisper. "This is just for you," he murmured. Then, with his hand resting on the guitar Elena had carried up for him, he strummed softly. The melody was simple, halting at first, but tender. His voice cracked, still hoarse from trauma, but alive. He sang a lullaby, not one from fear, but from gratitude. "Good dog, strong dog, you heard me in the night. You carried my song, you led me to the light." His words trembled, but they carried through the microphone left too close to the stage. The crowd fell utterly silent, listening to the child who had once sung in chains, now singing freely to the one who had freed him. Elena wept openly, her face buried in her hands. Herrera blinked hard, his throat burning, his vow echoing silently in his chest. The officers around them stood straighter, some with tears glinting in their eyes. Ranger pressed closer to the boy, his tail thumping once, then twice, as though keeping rhythm with the fragile melody. Noah finished softly, his voice fading into the spring air. He leaned into Ranger, whispering so only the shepherd could hear. "Thank you for listening." The applause that followed was not thunderous, it was tender. It swelled like a wave of gratitude, rolling across the plaza, rising and falling with the weight of a city's love. People stood again, some with hands over their hearts, others raising sparrow drawings high in the air. The chief stepped back to the podium, but she did not try to speak over the applause. Instead, she waited, eyes glistening, until it quieted again. "Let this day remind us," she said firmly, "that hope survives when voices are heard, and sometimes it is the loyalty of a dog that ensures we hear them." When the ceremony ended, people surged forward, not to clamor for the spotlight, but to place flowers at the foot of the stage, to press drawings into Elena's hands, to whisper prayers of thanks. And in the center of it all, Ranger remained steady, Noah leaning into him, Elena at their side, Herrera watching with pride and resolve. The banners would eventually come down, the medal would find its place in a case, but the image of a boy singing a lullaby to his dog would linger. In that plaza, amid tears and applause, a city had been reminded that even in its darkest alleys, light could still be found in the song of a child and the steadfast heart of a shepherd. The sun dipped low over Detroit, casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow street where the Carter home stood. The evening light was golden, warm, and forgiving, bathing the block in a glow that felt like healing. For weeks, neighbors had come by with food, flowers, drawings, and prayers. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was no tragedy hanging in the air, only expectation, the kind that carried with it the quiet hum of hope. On the porch, Noah sat with his small guitar cradled in his lap. The wood gleamed faintly in the sunset, strings tuned with Herrera's careful hands earlier that day. He had grown stronger, still thin, still marked by scars inside and out. But there was color in his cheeks again, and a steadiness in his posture that had not been there before. At his feet, Ranger lay stretched across the boards, his chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of a soldier finally at rest. His head rested on his paws, ears twitching at every sound, eyes fixed on the street as though guarding not just Noah, but the music that had yet to come. The shepherd had been there through nightmares and hospital rooms, through moments when Noah was too afraid to close his eyes. Tonight, he was there again, steady as stone, soft as breath. Elena stood just inside the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. She tried to hold back tears, but they brimmed anyway. Not of grief this time, but of awe. She remembered the first time she'd taught her son a song, how his tiny voice had echoed in their kitchen. She remembered the silence that had followed his disappearance, the unbearable quiet. And now, she watched as he prepared to sing again, this time not in fear, but in freedom. Neighbors gathered at the curb, their faces soft with anticipation. Children sat cross-legged on the grass. Parents stood hand in hand. A block that had once carried the weight of despair now waited for its songbird to return. Noah's fingers trembled as they pressed against the strings. For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. Elena stepped forward, her voice steady, though her throat was thick with tears. "Whenever you're ready, baby. We're here. We'll listen." The boy looked down at Ranger. The shepherd lifted his head, pressing his muzzle against Noah's leg, his amber eyes meeting the child's as if to say, "I'm here too. Sing." Noah drew in a breath, his chest rising with the weight of it. Then, softly at first, he strummed. The sound was uneven, hesitant, but alive. His lips parted, and his voice slipped into the evening air. It was fragile at the start, cracking in places, trembling as though afraid of its own echo. But as the chords carried, the voice grew steadier. The words were simple, a melody familiar to the neighborhood, but sung with a depth far beyond his years. "I sang so you would hear me. I sang to stay alive. Now the night has lost its silence, and the sparrow's song survives." The crowd stilled. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. Some neighbors bowed their heads, others wept openly. The children on the grass swayed softly, wide-eyed, sensing they were hearing something bigger than a song. Noah's voice rose higher, no longer hesitant. His small frame leaned into the music, his eyes closing as if every note carried him further from the shadows. Ranger stayed pressed against him, tail wagging faintly, his ears flicking with every vibration of the guitar. As the final verse trembled into the sunset, the boy's voice cracked, but he kept going. And when the last note faded, the silence that followed was not the silence of loss. It was reverence. Then, like the breaking of dawn, applause erupted. Neighbors clapped, some shouting his name, others crying too hard to speak. The block shook with joy. Elena stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her son from behind, pressing her cheek against his hair, whispering, "You did it, baby. You brought the song back." Noah leaned into her embrace, but his eyes went to Ranger. He set the guitar aside and bent, pressing his forehead against the shepherd's. His voice, barely audible over the applause, whispered, "Thank you for listening, when no one else could." Ranger whined softly, licking the boy's cheek, then settled again at his feet, ever watchful, as though anchoring the moment in eternity. Herrera stood at the edge of the street, hands in his pockets, watching. He didn't clap, didn't cheer. He simply bowed his head, the corners of his lips lifting with quiet pride. The vow he had made in the hospital replayed in his mind. You'll never be silenced again. Tonight, he knew the boy had proven it true. As the applause faded and the sun dipped below the horizon, the block returned to quiet once more. But it was not the heavy silence of grief. It was the silence of peace, of a neighborhood restored by the song of a sparrow and the loyalty of a dog who had carried him back into the light. And in that quiet, a truth lingered, unshakable. Even in darkness, a child's song and a dog's steadfast heart can keep hope alive. Sometimes the hardest nights remind us of the simplest truths, that love can carry us through, and that a dog's loyalty can be as steady as the beating of our own hearts. Stories like Noah and Ranger's are more than rescues. They're reminders that the bond we share with animals heals us in ways words often can't. A German shepherd's watchful eyes, the weight of their head on your lap, the quiet comfort they give without asking anything in return. It's a gift beyond measure. If you've ever wanted to deepen that kind of connection with your own dog, there are gentle resources out there that can help guide the way. I came across one recently that felt more like a companion than a manual. It's worth a look if your heart is nudging you in that direction. At the end of the day, what matters most is that we keep listening to them, just as they've always listened to us. And maybe, if you feel the same way I do, you'll carry that thought forward. Because in every way, every bark, every quiet moment, there's a little reminder that hope and love are never far from home.